History remembers the headlines. We find the bylines. This is the unsung. When you hear that eerie, wavering sound, you might think of 1950 sci-fi movies, the haunting theme of the day the Earth stood still, or maybe even the Beach Boys' Good Vibrations. The instrument is iconic, but the man behind it is a ghost. Léon Theremin invented the first electronic musical instrument in 1920, performed for Lennon himself, toured the world, and lived in a New York penthouse as a celebrity inventor. But in 1938, he vanished. Officially, he was dead. In reality, he had been kidnapped by the KGB and forced into clandestine weapons research. So how was a man of his stature, a global pioneer of electronic music, erased from history and turned into a state-sponsored spy? Lev Sergeyevich Termin, who would later be known as Léon Theremin, was born in St. Petersburg in 1896, a child of the twilight of Imperial Russia. He was a physics prodigy, fascinated by electricity and sound from a young age. As a young man, he found himself swept up in the tides of revolution. By 1919, he was working in a Soviet lab in Petrograd, a city still reeling from war and upheaval. The Bolshevik government was desperate for technological innovation, both as a tool of progress and a symbol of its new power. It was in this charged atmosphere that Theremin made his accidental discovery. While working on a high-frequency oscillator to measure the density of gases, he noticed that his hand's proximity to the circuit altered its electromagnetic field, producing a strange, ethereal tone from a connected speaker. The closer his hand, the higher the pitch. He was, quite literally, pulling sound out of thin air. Instead of dismissing it as a fluke, he saw its artistic potential. By 1920, he had refined this principle into an instrument he called the Thereminvox. It was a marvel of minimalist design, a simple wooden box with two antennas. One antenna controlled pitch, the other volume. The performer stood before it, never touching it, sculpting sound with graceful, ballet-like movements of their hands. It was unlike anything anyone had ever seen or heard. When he demonstrated it for Vladimir Lenin in the Kremlin, the Soviet leader was captivated. Lenin saw the Thereminvox not just as a musical curiosity, but as a powerful propaganda tool, a symbol of Soviet ingenuity and a new, electrified future. He sent Theremin on a grand tour across Europe and eventually to the United States to showcase this miracle of the socialist state. Theremin arrived in New York in 1927, stepping into the heart of the Roaring Twenties. The city was a dazzling whirlwind of jazz, skyscrapers, and artistic modernism. He quickly became a sensation. He patented his invention, anglicized his name to Léon Theremin, and established a studio where he taught a new generation of musicians. He performed to sold-out crowds at Carnegie Hall. His apartment became a salon for the era's brightest minds. He socialized with Albert Einstein, who reportedly tried to play the instrument, financial titans like John D. Rockefeller, and avant-garde composers like Henry Cowell, who were eager to explore this new sonic territory. To the public, he was the charismatic face of a new musical frontier. But behind this glamorous facade, another life was unfolding. Theremin was also an asset for Soviet intelligence, leveraging his high society access to pass technical information and industrial secrets back to his handlers in Moscow. He was living a double life, a delicate balancing act between art and espionage. Theremin's contributions were truly dual-track, running on parallel paths of artistic innovation and clandestine engineering. Musically, he was a true visionary. The Theremin was revolutionary, the first instrument to generate sound entirely electronically, without any strings, reeds, or keys. It laid the foundational groundwork for the synthesizers of Robert Moog, who started his career by building theremin kits, and the entire landscape of modern electronic music we know today. He didn't stop there. He also collaborated on the Rhythm Icon, an early and incredibly complex drum machine capable of playing intricate polyrhythms. He was even developing early forms of color television and multimedia systems, decades ahead of their time. But this public-facing genius had a dark ops counterpart. In 1938, his New York idol came to an abrupt end. He was forcibly returned to the Soviet Union, kidnapped from his apartment by KGB agents. The public story was that he had simply returned home, but the reality was far more brutal. Accused of anti-Soviet propaganda, he was thrown into the Gulag system and eventually assigned to a Sharashka, a secret research and development prison. These were intellectual dungeons, where brilliant scientists and engineers, deemed enemies of the state, were forced to work on advanced technology for the Soviet military. The conditions were grim, a stark contrast to his Manhattan lifestyle, but the work was cutting edge. It was here that Theremin created his most infamous espionage device, the Great Seal Bug, also known simply as the Thing. In 1945, a group of Soviet schoolchildren presented a gift to the U.S. ambassador in Moscow, a beautiful, hand-carved wooden plaque of the Great Seal of the United States. The ambassador proudly hung it in his residential study. Hidden inside was Theremin's device. It was a masterpiece of covert engineering, a passive listening device with no power source and no active components. It was essentially a tiny antenna and a diaphragm that vibrated with sound waves in the room. It would only become active when Soviet agents from a nearby building bathed it in a specific radio frequency. This signal powered the bug and carried the reflected, modulated audio back to their receivers. It was ingenious, elegant, and completely undetectable by the security sweeps of the time. For 7 years, the Soviets listened in on confidential conversations happening right inside the U.S. ambassador's office. It wasn't discovered until 1952, and even then, American intelligence couldn't figure out how it worked for years. While imprisoned, Theremin also developed other remote surveillance systems and technology for detecting submarines. The same mind that created an instrument of ethereal beauty was now designing tools for silent, invisible warfare. Theremin's erasure from history was not an accident. It was a systematic, state-sponsored campaign. The KGB fabricated his death to quash any inquiries from his friends and colleagues in the West. He had vanished, and the world was led to believe he was gone forever. Inside the Soviet Union, his name was suppressed. His groundbreaking musical work was dismissed as a capitalist curiosity, a frivolous dalliance from his time abroad. Meanwhile, his invaluable espionage inventions were classified at the highest level. He was a ghost in his own country, his past achievements wiped clean, his present work a state secret. In the West, his disappearance led to a form of cultural amnesia. He was assumed dead, a tragic figure from a bygone era. The instrument he created lived on, kept alive by a small community of enthusiasts and pioneers like Robert Moog. But Theremin the man faded into myth, his name detached from his own creation. The truth remained buried for decades. It wasn't until the 1960s, during a thaw in the Cold War, that a young American journalist, intrigued by the mystery, tracked him down. He found Theremin not in a place of honor, but living in a small apartment in Moscow, working in relative obscurity at the Moscow Conservatory. The world was shocked to learn he was alive. Yet, it took the fall of the Soviet Union for him to truly reemerge. In the early 1990s, at over 90 years old, he was finally able to travel again, touring the United States and Europe. He was a living relic, a man out of time, greeted by audiences who had known his instrument but never his story. Today, Léon Theremin is celebrated as the grandfather of electronic music, a foundational figure whose work inspired generations of artists and engineers. But his full story, inventor, performer, spy, and prisoner, remains a chilling lesson in how states can instrumentalize genius. His life was a constant negotiation between artistic freedom and the demands of absolute power. He created an instrument that symbolized a boundless, untouchable freedom, while his own life was subjected to capture, control, and confinement. He died in 1993, having seen his strange, wonderful instrument take on a life of its own, but never fully receiving the credit for how deeply his inventions shaped both our culture and the silent wars fought in the shadows. His story forces us to ask, who are the other innovators whose lives were hijacked by geopolitical forces, their legacies twisted or buried by the states they served? Share their stories in the comments below. And for more hidden histories, subscribe to the Unsung.